eventually to Cleveland. By 1850, you could get from the East Coast to Chicago. And by 1856, the first bridge was built across the Mississippi River. And then, of course, the one date in American railroad history that most people know, if they know anything about it, is 1869, which was the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad. So look, in just 39 years, we went from nothing to having transcontinental railroads. And that resulted in these little organizations merging. So a railroad you might have been familiar with, the New York Central, which connected New York and Boston to St. Louis and Chicago, was eventually assembled out of what was at one time 546 different little railroad companies. And that consolidation took place. Now, how that affected the cuisine is, these railroads were competing with each other for riders. The passenger cars were built by the Pullman Company, so there's nothing to distinguish those. Because of the competition, the time schedule was pretty much the same. I mean, the New York Central and the Pennsylvania Railroad raced from New York to Chicago with the 20th Century Limited for the New York Central and the Broadway Limited for the Pennsylvania. Both of them left New York City at 2:15 p.m. And there's a 6-mile stretch of track in Hammond, Indiana, where if those trains were running on time, they would literally be racing each other down that section of track to get into the city of Chicago first. The Erie Railroad operated a through passenger train from Jersey City to Chicago, same schedule. So how do you distinguish yourself? Cuisine. Okay, so the Milwaukee Road, for example, there were 4 railroads that connected Chicago with Minneapolis and St. Paul. But you can only get that really good onion soup and that fresh bread muffin if you rode to Milwaukee. That was one thing. This is how they tried to distinguish themselves against other railroads. You'll see out there on the table a picture of one of the specialty dishes of the Northern Pacific Railroad called the Great Big Baked Potato.
Right.
Now that potato weighed 2 pounds minimum, 5 pounds maximum. Big. Okay? And you can only get it on the Northern Pacific Railroad. Now their arch rival, one of their arch rivals in that service, which was Chicago to the northwest, Seattle and Portland, was the Great Northern Railroad. And they weren't about to be outdone, so they launched a thing called the Great Big Baked Apple. How big was that? Well, it was a 48-count apple. Okay, that doesn't mean anything to me. So I went to the supermarket in my town, and I said to the produce manager, "What does that mean, a 48-count apple?" He said, "That's how many apples fit in a case." Okay. So I picked up one of those red Macintosh apples, and I said, "So what's the count on these?" 125. So this thing was more than 2.5 times bigger than the apple that you'd normally buy in the supermarket. And what the Great Northern did was, they took a baking dish, like a 9x13 baking dish, poured 2 cups of sugar in it. They poured 6 of those apples and set them in the sugar, filled the center with a cinnamon sugar mix, put one of those little red and white mint candies on top of it, and then put it in the oven to bake and basted it. So essentially they're making a candied apple. That was available for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. You could get it on any meal. So there you have them competing with cuisine. And then the second thing they were competing for is shippers. So those of you who cook probably know the generic name for an Idaho potato. It's a russet. You go to the supermarket. But if it grows in Idaho, it's not a russet, it's an Idaho potato. You can thank the Union Pacific Railroad for that, because that's the railroad that hauled all the potatoes out of Idaho. And the Union Pacific had a test kitchen where they would prepare recipes that they could then use on board the train and demonstrate to the potato growers in Idaho that they're supporting their efforts. So the Union Pacific, for example, steak, beef steak, what are you going to do with that? It's going to be grilled, right? Or broiled. But on the Union Pacific, it came with onion rings. But unlike onion rings that you can buy today, those onion rings were made with potato flour and potato meal. The Union Pacific had perfected the technique for grinding down the potatoes and making them into meal. I mentioned to you that there's one recipe in the cookbook that I tinkered with. And this was a specialty of the Texas and Pacific Railroad. The Texas and Pacific Railroad ran from Missouri, Arkansas, Texas, and then west. And one of their executive chefs was frustrated. The chefs were evaluated. If they threw stuff that was perishable away, they would critique for it. Because that's waste. And canned goods aren't waste. Well, one of the things he was throwing away a lot of, were cantaloupes. So he experimented and experimented, and he eventually perfected a thing called cantaloupe pie. And he made this recipe on his train. Now back to the shippers. One time, a Texas and Pacific train was hauling a private car with a bunch of cantaloupe growers on it. So he made cantaloupe pie for them. Guess what railroad got the contract to haul cantaloupes out of Arkansas after that? It was Texas and Pacific. But I tried that recipe a number of times, and I could not get it to work. I think the first time I tried it, I thought, okay, this proves I could have been a chef, because I was having a dinner party on a Saturday evening, and I thought, I'm going to make cantaloupe pie. So that morning I made cantaloupe pie, made the crust, simmered it, took it and poured it in the pie shell, put it in my refrigerator, and 8 hours later, guess what? It hadn't gelled at all. It was still pretty thick fluid. So here's my genius. I poured it out and served it over vanilla ice cream. Everybody says, oh, this is great. Where did you buy this? I said, damn, I need that. Now, so I could not get that recipe to work. And Pete Bordy said to me, he says, you know, it should have the consistency of pumpkin pies. So he says, why don't you add 3 tablespoons of cornstarch or a packet of unflavored gelatin to the recipe? So I did that, and I got it to work. All right? The cookbook's published. And I get a call from the guy who runs the Paul Robeson Center at Penn State University, which is the Penn State's African American Studies program. He says, I want to get 4 copies of your book. He says, you know, you have my father-in-law's recipe for cantaloupe pie in the book. He's going to get a real kick out of that. And I thought, oh, it's the only recipe I added an ingredient to, and the guy's still alive, and he's going to take the recipe. So I signed the books, and I wrote the fellow a note and apologized. And I said, you know, I could never get it to gel. And so I added an ingredient. And it had 2 happy endings in my mind. Number one, I got a real nice letter from the guy back. He was at the top of his profession, an African-American male. He had graduated from Tuskegee Institute's culinary training program. And he had risen to be the chef de cuisine of a major American railroad. He was the top of the whole food structure for Texas and Pacific. So that was one thing, getting a letter back from him, and him seeing his recipe immortalized in a book, I think it would make today. But the second thing was, as an author, I couldn't have asked for more publicity. Every wire service in America did an article on that book. Well, but he lived in Fort Worth, and the Fort Worth newspaper did a front page food section Sunday newspaper article about this guy and his career. He was in his late 70s at that time, and so he got celebrated in his community for his achievements as a railroad chef. So that's why the food got to be so good. The railroads were competing with each other for riders, and they were competing with each other for shippers. And so they specialized in these dishes. Yes?
What did he say about what you read in his recipe?
Oh, okay. Here's what he said. I'm sorry. All right, that recipe appeared originally in an employee magazine, the Texas and Pacific Employee Magazine, sometime in the late 1940s. I did get recipe. Some of the railroads, the women in here would really find this interesting, because the railroads published magazines for their employees. And many of them had a section in the magazine for the housewife. And it included recipes of what's being served on the dining cars. It encouraged them to buy homes, so we'd always have home plans in there, and games and activities for children. And what their purpose was to try to stabilize the home life of the trainmen, give them a stable family life, because they were better employees that way. Well, anyway, so this recipe had appeared in the Texas and Pacific Employee Magazine at one time as a specialty of the railroad. He said it was a typo. Now, if you know anything about chefs, you know, he probably told them, but the recipe in the magazine said to simmer the sauce for 20 minutes. He says you really have to simmer it more like an hour to get all the moisture out of it. And he says then it'll set up in the pie shell. By then, of course, the book was published, and I've left that in there. I got a letter recently from a guy that trains children, you know, does children's programming, and he uses that recipe with them because he says they get a real kick out of making cantaloupe into pie, and then that's something they can do at home. So, but that was the secret behind that. The other thing to share with you, just a little bit in the time we have, is I think probably most of you are aware of the way this has affected your life. So I'm going to name a couple things. Some of them real, some of them lifestyle oriented. One, most of you probably know what Bisquick is. Bisquick was a creation of the Southern Pacific Railroad. Their food department wanted to have a way to have fresh, hot, risen biscuits on their morning trains. So they concocted this recipe that they made as a dough and then stored it in their commissary and put it on the trains in the morning. Now, General Mills, an executive on General Mills, got on a train in Portland one morning and couldn't believe how good these biscuits were and how they get them made so quickly. So he wandered back to the chef on the train, and I said, I'm sure the dining car department or the chef neither one got any royalties from this. What General Mills did do, of course, they made it into a powder, so it had shelf life as opposed to liquid. But the recipe for biscuit came from the Southern Pacific Railroad. That's one. A second thing, I don't know how many of you know what I mean by sandwich bread, which are those square loaves of bread. Okay? The pan to make those loaves square was patented by the Pullman Company, because you can get 3 loaves of bread in the same space that if it had a crown on it, you'd only get 2 loaves in there. And space was at such a premium in the dining cars that they patented this pan and they could bake their loaves of bread so they came out of the oven square instead of crown. And then the third thing some of you probably have used are what generically are known as pressed sawdust logs. Think of Duraflame, that sort of thing. The train was powered by the steam locomotive, and the kitchen got its heat and its steam for keeping foods hot from the steam locomotive. But as the railroads moved to diesels, they didn't have steam power anymore. Now what the Western railroads grew concerned with is avalanches, trapping trains in the mountains somewhere. And if we don't have a steam engine to keep the kitchen running, how are we going to feed people on these trapped trains? Probably the most famous one in terms of how long it was delayed was the city of San Francisco was trapped in an avalanche for almost a week in the Rockies sometime in the 1950s.
1952.
1952. And I just recently put up a thing I found of 2 passenger trains in, I think it was in Canada, but it might have been in the Northern Pacific. Maybe you know this one too. But 2 passenger trains were swept off a mountainside.
That was the Great Northern, that was Cascades, that was by 1911.
Killed a lot of people.
Yeah. That was the Cascade disaster, there's a book out about it.
Right. So this was a legitimate worry. So they worked with Weyerhaeuser to develop these pressed sawdust logs, thinking of them as an emergency thing, but the chefs loved them for 3 reasons. One is they burn hot, and they burn clean, and there's no residue left when they're done burning. I mean, it's just a little bit of powder is all that's left over from them. So by their peak, when the Union Pacific, the dining car superintendent told me at one point they were using a boxcar load of those logs every week on their dining car operation. So those are real things. The things that are less tangible but nonetheless real, one of them is fast food. And railroads had 300 people to feed in a 2 or 3 hour period of time. So they didn't let people linger very long at the table. And that was criticized, but it was a necessity, as people would come in. If you've ever eaten, and Amtrak does it the same way on their long distance trains.